G'day folks, welcome to this side-by-side comparison where I'll contrast the series rules from the Battles from the Age of Reason against the rules from the Bataille series. When I look at the Bataille series, I'll consider both the introductory Marie-Louise rules and the more complex Regs XXX series of rules. They're the two rule sets that I've played within that series. Now, one of the first considerations, first points of contrast, is that there are far more publications in the Bataille series. There are over 30 different titles, with the first of these being published way back in 1975. That was Bataille de Moskova. It was followed very quickly by Auerstadt and Project Eylau. Whereas in the Battles from the Age of Reason series, we have to wait until, I think, 1994 with the publication of Cologne, Frederick's first defeat by Clash of Arms games. And there are now 9 different titles in that series, stretching over 25 years. So you certainly have more variety in the Bataille series. Keep in mind though, with the Battles from the Age of Reason series, you often have two battles within the one publication. Another consideration just at the outset is that they of course reflect different periods of warfare. Marginally different, but still some years apart. So the Battles from the Age of Reason series focus on the mid-18th century, battles from the Wars of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War from the 1750s, 1760s, through to the American Revolutionary War, War of Independence in the 1770s, with I think the last battle being the Battle of Monmouth from 1778. In contrast, the Bataille series focuses on Napoleonic warfare, focusing mainly on the 1800s and 1810s, with the earliest battle in that series being a very small publication, or Pont de Lodi, just a very small one map, which was from 1796. But most of these battles are between 1805 and 1815. So you look at different periods of warfare, and that's certainly reflected by the way the rules play out and how it feels, and the abilities that different units in these battles have. Certainly much has changed in warfare in this period of time. Now, building on from that, the next point is, how do these games feel? What do they feel like to play? And for me, the thing that really most stood out was that the Battles from the Age of Reason series felt slower. Units are certainly moving slower. They take longer to change facing. They can take an entire turn to change formation, and they move towards the enemy at a much slower rate. Most of the infantry have 4 movement points. If they turn slightly to the right, they're spending 1, perhaps 2 movement points, and then they have movement point allowances to move perhaps 1 or 2 spaces forward. In contrast, in the Bataille series, units infantry often have 6, 7, maybe even 8 movement points, I think I've seen on some, and they can move very rapidly, at least twice, perhaps 3 times as far as what a unit from the Battles from the Age of Reason could move in the same period of time over the same terrain. So the Battles from the Age of Reason series is much slower. It is slower to move your forces around. This requires you to think very carefully about where you place your units. They are far less mobile. They are more, think of them as being more rigid, more fixed in place. You move your infantry to a position and they stand and fight in that position. For me, playing both series, this Battles from the Age of Reason gave a greater sense of, I guess you could say, command frustration and being actual a commander on the field. At times, Bataille can feel a bit loose with command and control, where there is the potential for units to be moving around quite wildly. That's probably as much a criticism of myself as a gamer playing these as it is of the rules, but certainly Bataille is looser in the movement rules. Units are far more restricted in their movement allowances within the Battles from the Age of Reason. And I'll talk more about movement later on, but all of these movement rules lend themselves more to a slower battle. It creates a different experience, essentially. BAR battles feel fixed and more fixed and rigid, which lends themselves to a closer sense of, I guess you could say, historicity, whereas Bataille feels more flexible, more fluid. Faster moving units means they can move to different parts of the battlefield more quickly than their earlier counterparts. Another point, and it's a pretty critical point of difference, is in the command activation between the two series of games. Bataille features a chit draw system where you place commanders in a cup, or sorry, their activation markers in a cup with their corresponding marker on a commander on the field of battle, and you draw a chit or a counter out of a cup. And when you draw a certain activation counter, you activate that command. In contrast, Battles from the Age of Reason series uses a command initiative die roll, and you compare your army commander's command value to determine who wins the initiative each activation, each roll, and they get to activate a command or a wing. Now, the net effect of this is that, Bataille moves much quicker. Because you can activate larger commands, you can activate entire large wings in Bataille much more easily. It generally is more of a struggle to do so in Battles from the Age of Reason. It is slower because you're often rolling dice. You've got to look at your commander command rating. You've got to contrast that with your opponent's die roll. Often it's very close. You're double checking. You need to consider if your commander has moved, because then there's a penalty. If there are other optional rules in the game, there may be further penalties to this, and it slows everything down just to activate a command. I far prefer the Bataille series of activation here. We just draw a counter out of the cup, and that command activates. It is so much easier. It creates more tension as well. I didn't find much tension in the dice rolls in BAR. I found it more frustrating than anything else. Whereas Bataille really gives. Well, you don't get to choose in Bataille. You have to activate the counter that you've drawn. So it's that tension, that excitement in Command, and I far prefer that over the BAR series. Now, aside from that activation, command of units and sort of things like brigade and divisional command are very similar. Similar command ranges, similar requirements to keep brigades close together. In fact, it's probably more rigid in BAR, which I think is a good thing. Again, lends itself more to that historical feeling of play. Brigades really do have to stay close together. They're a bit looser, and again, this is partly a criticism of me as a gamer, but divisions often became a bit stretched out when I was playing in some Bataille titles. They really do have to keep tight together in BAR. You are keeping these regiments or battalions in a very tight line, and indeed in a line. There are harsher penalties in BAR for being flanked, and there are these options to refuse your flanks in BAR. In Bataille, this is reflected by simply placing a unit just to the rear on the edge of the line. So again, some subtle differences there in terms of command and activation, but by and large they feel very similar. Now let me return to movement. I touched on this earlier as one of the key differences that made the games feel different. The movement rates of infantry units in BAR are roughly 2/3 to half of the typical infantry unit in Bataille. This means they can't move far, basically. In a 20-minute turn, they are lucky, very lucky to move 4 spaces, lucky to move 3 spaces forward. Typically, they're only able to move 1 or 2 hexes on their turn. A change of facing can take up half, if not all, of their movement allowance for that turn. So you're not really maneuvering all over the field. Where you place your units, where they march to, is pretty much where they are fighting for the next few hours. As I said earlier, I see this as a good thing. This is not a criticism of BAR. I think this is great. It gives a great sense of being tied to your units, of picking your side of battle, of being that commander, of setting up your forces. Conversely, as I said earlier, sometimes when I play Bataille, my units can be moving quite crazily around, and it feels a bit unrealistic at times. Again, as I said, criticism of myself as much as those looser movement rules. Now, tied to this multi-hex formations. This isn't a feature of the Marie-Louise series of rules in La Bataille, but it is in the Regs 30, and it is also a feature in the BAR series. So in BAR, you do have multi-hex formations almost identical to, if not a little easier, in fact, than the Regs 30 series of La Bataille. Infantry and cavalry can form multi-hex formations. There aren't too many differences in the rules between the two series there. There is, however, a difference in the way cavalry works, and without going into too much detail, because I could spend an entire video just on the cavalry rules from Regs 30 alone. I think they take up about 10 pages of the Regs 30 rulebook, but I found cavalry to be much easier in the BAR series. In fact, it really hit the sweet spot in cavalry rules for me. Multi-hex formation cavalry, moving during their movement phase, declaring a charge during the close combat phase, rolling for morale, the opponent, if they have cavalry, having the opportunity charge. It all played out very nicely, very clearly. The series rules for cavalry movement and charge and countercharge were all presented very clearly. That I don't know if it's my La Bataille series experience, but I grasped them very quickly. This is in contrast to the Regs 30 cavalry rules, which I still don't understand and still struggle with regularly. Let me say this, I can play the cavalry rules in BAR without needing to consult the rulebook. I still need to consult the rulebook for Regs 30 when I'm doing cavalry. At the other far left end of the spectrum are the cavalry rules for Marie-Louise, where they are, if anything, oversimplified. To the point where cavalry are overpowered because of their ease of maneuvering around the battlefield and doing damage and so forth. BAR hit the sweet spot between powerful cavalry and ease of rules. So that was quite nice. Now, fire combat is very similar. Of course, in the BAR series, you have a designated fire combat step on a command activation, but it's much the same as in both La Bataille series of rules, Marie-Louise and Regs 30, with the exception that there are no ricochet rules. There are ricochet rules in Regs 30. I never liked them. It can be just quite frustrating. I forget it a lot of the time. It can be frustrating figuring out where a cannonball is flying. You're lining up hexes and so forth. I never really liked it. So there's no ricochet in BAR, but some infantry can engage in range fire beyond that one hex, which I found to be a bit interesting because these are older muskets from the mid-18th century and they have a longer range than these Napoleonic muskets from 50 years later. They are, of course, firing at much reduced fire rates, often just a ×1 multiplier to their fire, so they're unlikely to hit at long range, but it's still interesting that that's an addition to the rule. I found the artillery in BAR to be weaker than artillery in La Bataille. Artillery and more complicated to use. In both Marie-Louise and Regs 30, artillery have ranges. It's easy to calculate, and they have firepowers for those ranges. And at close range, they can launch devastating, canister shot against advancing infantry. In contrast, in BAR, artillery certainly did their damage and do damage, but it's based on a multiplier, and I never found that multiplier to be particularly powerful or overly effective, with the net result being that artillery at close range weren't quite as devastating as close range artillery is during the Napoleonic era. There were fewer artillery pieces around, and it play a slightly different role compared to those guns from the Napoleonic era. Okay, let's contrast close combat or assault. Now, the two series use a fairly similar combat or assault resolution sequence involving morale checks, defensive fire, comparison of odds and so forth. There are different modifiers for various things. The main difference being in La Bataille, in both series, you're rolling once on an assault and melee chart to get a result. In BAR, both the attacker and defender are rolling a die each, and they're adding modifiers to their own die. This, the need for both attacker and defender to roll a die and then contrast slows this process down. Sometimes, I mean, especially if you're playing solo, you're trying to keep track of the two rolls and +5 here and then +1 and then -5 because they're shaken and all this kind of thing, and then subtract the defender's dice roll minus 1 for this and +3 and all that, to then get a modifier, and then to remember what column of the close combat chart you were on. It could be confusing at times, but it was quite tense. It made these dice rolls very important. But then also you can get the difference between some quite big swings in close combat that you wouldn't otherwise get, I don't think, from the La Bataille series. Much of this, of course, depends on that odds ratio. They're different. I don't think I have a preference either way for these. I did like those dice rolls at time. It created some real tension in these battles when certain players are attacking and charging and really hoping to get a lucky result, or when the defenders are just really hoping to roll high and hope the attackers with their cavalry superiority roll really low, which certainly happens sometimes. It can create some really interesting and dramatic swings in combat. And I think La Bataille series is just a little bit more, maybe this is just my imagination, maybe it felt a little bit less swingy. Close combat in BAR felt more consequential, and there were sort of clear outcomes to the battles, a lot of routing in this, in contrast to the sort of often disorder results from the La Bataille series of melee. So there's often a clear outcome in close combat in BAR compared to La Bataille, where you can have two infantry battalions going head to head for hours, just standing opposite each other. That happens to a lesser extent in BAR. There are clearer resolutions to these battles. Now, I should point out that BAR is based on I think it's called a D10 or a D100 system, where for many things like morale checks and fire combat, you are basically rolling 2 D10s with one dice representing the 10s and the other dice representing the 1s, so you can roll from anything from 0 up to 99. And for every purpose, I much prefer this over the La Bataille D6 or D66 system, where you're rolling anything from 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, then you go up to 21, 22, up to 66. It's just so much easier to subtract 23 from 63 than it is to subtract 23 from a 63 in the D6 or D66 based system. Easy to do those maths. And just nicer to have these clearer 0 to 100 numbers. You get a clearer sense of what 32 morale actually means. If you've got 32 morale, you have roughly a 1 in 3 chance of failing your morale check. Now, morale, I really also, in the BAR system, there is the shaken and disorder and routed status are all separated. So units become disordered. And this represents just effectively disorder or sort of chaos permeating throughout the battalion. Shaken represents their morale status, and I really like how those two are separated in the BAR series. So units become shaken, their morale is disrupted during combat. They can be shaken without being disordered. They can be disordered without being shaken, or they can be shaken and disordered. And they have different effects on different things. Units that are disordered fire less effectively. Units that are shaken suffer greater morale loss when charged by the enemy. And of course, units rout. I really like the rout rules in BAR. They were very simple, partly due to the lower movement rates on these infantry units. It's pretty straightforward rout rules. In contrast, in Le Bataille, you have disorder and plus grand disorder, or basically routed, all grouped in together, which I always didn't have a problem with. I just liked that BAR added that extra shaken status to differentiate between morale and the ordered status of a unit. And again, that gave a greater sense of realism without overcomplicating things. That differentiation doesn't really complicate things. It just adds a level of nice detail. One rule from BAR that did overcomplicate things unnecessarily were the events. Whenever you roll a 0 on the tens dice for things like a morale check, a disorder check, fire combat, artillery combat, you have to consult this events chart. And the events chart basically has events. Things like the unit is disordered, re-roll with a +10 modifier, no special result. It was just, you have to consult this table, consult the special results tables booklet, find the category of die roll you're making, whether it was a defensive fire result, an artillery fire result, a leader loss result, and so forth. And then consult the group that were making the roll, whether they were French, English, and so forth, and then consult the actual result on the die to figure out whether it was a lucky shot, braving enemy fire, a wildfire, heavy smoke, regimental guns, and so forth, and then check the effect of that event, and then often re-roll to determine something else with a modifier. I really didn't like that. Really frustrating. Really slowed things down. In future, I don't think I'm going to play with those events in BAR games that I play, because it was just frustrating, and it slowed things down a lot for very minimal effect on the actual outcome of the game. And of course, that's absent from the Le Bataille series entirely. And one of the final things to comment on is the relative scarcity of modifiers in BAR. So the Le Bataille series, including the Marie-Louise series, is famous for its many charts with many modifiers to everything from rolling to stand, rolling to close, cavalry charge, cavalry melee modifiers. BAR certainly has modifiers, but to a far lesser extent than Le Bataille, both Marie-Louise and Regs XXX, and I really like that. Yes, there's still a lot of consulting the charts, and close combat has a lot of modifiers. Morale checks have modifiers. Fire checks certainly have modifiers. Fire combat has modifiers, and so forth, various things, but it is to a far lesser extent than Le Bataille. And the problem with Le Bataille is you often miss modifiers. You often miss things like defending units are prone. I forgot about that. That was a +3 modifier. Target is being assaulted in the rear. That's hard to miss. But yeah, easy to miss a lot of these modifiers when there are just so many of them. Cavalry at Dusk have a -4 morale point modifier. Yeah, anyway, so I liked that there were fewer modifiers in BAR on the whole. Okay, so taking all these considerations in together, they are different game series, but they are very similar. They end up playing. I mean, every title in this series is different, and there are, of course, title-specific rules, but they end up playing similarly in terms of the way you resolve fire combat and close combat and so forth, the movement of brigades and so forth, trying to confront the enemy. It is similar, but for me, BAR was easier to grasp, easier to understand, and partly this may come from having played Labatt before, but BAR was easy to grasp, easy to understand, streamlined in the way it needed to be streamlined, cavalry in particular. I'd make a few changes to command and those events, but the slower speed of combat was nice. It lowered the tempo a little bit, gives you more time to think about things. You're not, I guess in essence what it does is BAR reduces the range of options available to your brigades when they activate. If an infantry battalion can only move, let's say 2 hexes forward, that's only 2 hexes you have to consider, not let's say 4, 5 or 6 hexes for the same battalion in Labatt. So it was, you're still making these broad operational strategic considerations, but those smaller tactical developments take place over an hour rather than every 20-minute activation as in Labatt. I'll be honest, I still prefer reflecting on Napoleonic warfare and the grand battles of Napoleon and these bigger maps and so forth, but I am leaning towards BAR rule set for all those reasons that I've mentioned. If I had my way, I would merge them together, and I'd have the command activation from Labatt. I'd have the slower movement rates. I'd just slow down the infantry in that Napoleonic period. And this is a reflection of history. These units, these battalions and regiments of the early 19th century were far more, yes, there were conscript forces, but they were far more professional than many of these units being used in the mid 18th century. And they could thus march longer distances in a 20-minute period compared to similar sized units in the 1750s. But for me, the cost of change facing the cost of change formation is accurate. I think that is something that is not really covered to the same, or penalised or considered to the same extent in Labatt. So yes, I would remove the use the Labatt chit draw activation rules from Regs 30 Marie Louise. I would use the cavalry rules from BAR. I would probably, I'm undecided on the close combat rules. I do like the fire combat sequence from BAR, but I like the short, medium, long range artillery system from Labatt. So there are pros and cons to each. Ultimately, there are several rule systems for Labatt. There's nothing probably stopping you from using BAR rules for Labatt games. Ultimately, there's little to separate the two. I think people will be mostly drawn by their interest in historical situations, campaigns, and battles, rather than the actual rule sets. And having said all that, if I were to recommend a rule set for a beginner, I would say either the Marie Louise series of rules for La Bataille or the Battles from the Age of Reason rule sets. They are, despite the BAR rules being about twice as long as Marie Louise, they are as easy to understand and as easy, if not a little easier, in fact, to play. The command rules are probably the biggest, the initiative determination and command activation are probably the biggest difficulties. But really, ultimately, you should be drawn to, I think, whatever battle and period grabs your interest rather than any particular rule set. So hopefully that's given you some consideration, some information. If you've played La Bataille before, if you've played BAR before, and you think about switching over, it's a pretty easy switch to make. Don't be scared off by the 48 or 60, 70 page rule books. They are easy to transfer from one to the other. And once these rules are in practice and you're playing them out, they play pretty smoothly. So hopefully that's been of some help. Good luck in your gaming decisions.